The House Committee on Education and Workforce has announced an investigation into Harvard, MIT, and UPenn. That's according to Fox News. The investigation comes just days after the presidents of those universities appeared on Capitol Hill in an attempt to defend how they've handled the polarizing response on their campuses to the Israeli-Hamas war. Republican lawmakers took aim at the college presidents, especially Harvard's new president, Claudine Gay. Here's Gay responding to questions from Republican Congressman Elise Stefanik.
Dr. Gay, does calling for the genocide of Jews violate Harvard's rules on bullying and harassment?
The rules around bullying and harassment are quite specific. And if the context in which that language is used amounts to bullying and harassment, then we take action against it.
Can you say yes to that question of does calling for the genocide of Jews violate Harvard's rules on bullying and harassment?
Calling for the genocide of Jews is anti-Semitic.
So yes.
And that is anti-Semitic speech. And as I have said,
and it's
when
a yes.
Speech crosses into conduct.
And it's a yes. I've asked the witnesses.
When speech crosses into conduct, we take action.
So is that a yes? Is that a yes? The witness hasn't answered. Madam Chair, is that a yes? You cannot answer the question.
Crosses into conduct.
I'm sorry.
We take action.
All right. Well, now calls for the president's resignation have been heard from Capitol Hill to Cambridge, and Harvard is also among a growing list of universities and school districts that the Department of Education is investigating over alleged incidents of anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. Now, here to break all that down to what we saw on Capitol Hill and on campuses this week is Kirk Carapezza, GBH News' managing editor for higher education. What an exchange, Kirk.
It was intense on the Hill. There's no red carpet for these college presidents.
That's right. And it seems like the question, all of them struggled with how to answer this question, because the concept of free speech and how to, I guess, make rules around it on college campuses is a difficult one.
Right, and it keeps coming up again and again, and social media isn't helping. A lot of this is playing out online behind the scenes. But I think the presidents really tried to defend their schools' responses to these incidents of anti-Semitism while preserving free speech. And Republicans, as you just heard, tried to use the hearing as a platform to point out again and again that there may be faculty or students who blamed the October 7th Hamas attack on the Israeli government, and that their response wasn't swift enough or quick enough. And it becomes this kind of backlash to the backlash story, right? There's the initial statement from the pro-Palestinian students who blame the attack on the Israeli government, and the president gets charged with not responding swiftly enough to that. But they're basically, they're trying to use this as political football to say, like, how did your campus get this way? Claudine Gay, said again and again that anti-Semitism has no place at Harvard, and that successful teaching and learning requires, the consideration of all viewpoints, even if they're outrageous. And that's what they're trying to strike this balance between free speech, public safety, and robust debate.
And it's so difficult because when you think about it as a constitutional question, we've heard constitutional scholars say, free speech is permitted unless it incites to violence or incites to harm. And I think that that's what Claudine Gay was sort of getting at in her answer.
Right.
But colleges, like most academic institutions, can make their own rules.
Right. And it comes down, what's tricky here, I think, is the specific terms, right? These groups can't even agree on the terms and their meanings, right? And so, we're hearing these things at some of the protests, both on campus and off campus, right? There's the phrase that everyone's hearing is, from the river to the sea, or global intifada. The pro-Palestinian group is describing that as a resistance movement, right? The pro-Israeli group hears those statements and they define it as a call to violence, and they feel threatened. And the presidents are stuck in the middle here trying to play referee. I think one thing that everyone can agree on is that there is an increase in both anti-Semitism and Islamophobia on campuses and off campuses, and often it goes underreported.
And it seemed like afterward, some of the presidents, especially in the case of the UPenn president, like, she went on to social media again to address after everything, and they were like, and it almost trying to quell what would probably be a response on campus from students from their testimony on Capitol Hill.
Right. I mean, they're clearly talking to lawyers, and they're in damage control too here, right? So they're reading from talking points, and there was the Stefanik interaction where she tried to pin her down on, saying, does calling for the genocide of any people, the Jewish people, does that violate your code of ethics? And Claudine Gay is coming under a lot of fire for her initial response to that, right, where she said, well, it depends on the context. She's since issued a statement after that saying, yes, that does violate the code of ethics at Harvard. But it depends who you talk to. Some people I'm talking to in higher ed who've observed how these presidents operate in these situations are saying, you know what, they acquitted themselves. They performed well considering the environment and the culture wars that we're seeing. Others said that it was a disaster. That they should have just unequivocally come out and said, yes, that violates our code. If there's calls for genocide, that violates our code. Some of these presidents are new, right? Claudine Gay, it's her first semester, right? Sally Kornbluth, who's Jewish American, it's her first semester. They've been thrown into the fire here, and it's not easy.
Yeah. In fact, we have a clip from President Kornbluth as well as she talked to Congresswoman Stefanik. So take a look at that.
At MIT, does calling for the genocide of Jews violate MIT's code of conduct or rules regarding bullying and harassment? Yes or no?
If targeted at individuals, not making public statements.
Yes or no? Calling for the genocide of Jews does not constitute bullying and harassment?
I have not heard calling for the genocide for Jews on our campus.
But you've heard chants for intifada.
I've heard chants, which can be anti-Semitic depending on the context, when calling for the elimination of the Jewish people. So
I'm also thoughtful about, what do media professionals in terms of people or PR folks are like probably looking at this and going, I don't know if I'd advise them that way.
Right, and it's something we struggle with in our newsroom. We have reporters who are covering protests that are on Boston Common, and they're hearing some of these chants, and they're coming back and saying, wow, I've never heard that before. And others are saying, that doesn't necessarily mean violence, right? So it's a tricky situation. When we talk to free speech advocates who are trying to kind of instill robust debate, because I talked to some professors, and one of the big problems right now on college campuses is that people aren't even talking to each other, right? So when you and I were in college, my experience was there was a lot of robust debate, right? And you could hear people who you disagreed with, and there was a lot of exchange. And in this moment, it sounds like people just aren't even talking to each other, right? And part of that, I'm hearing, is social media, where people are afraid of someone capturing it on social media and putting it online. And if you're a professor trying to teach students about these very complex issues, it's hard to have a discussion if people are afraid of being captured on social media and broadcast to the world. A lot of schools are turning to the University of Chicago, which in 2014, after student protests, after students invited controversial speakers on campus, and those speakers were disinvited, they developed what's called the Chicago Principles, and it's basically calling for overarching robust debate and free speech. And it tells colleges that there's no obligation to comment on everything, right? That if you feel obligated to speak up as an individual, as a president, you can speak up. And since then, more than 70 colleges have signed on to these principles. It includes Georgetown, Virginia Tech, Princeton, Purdue, Brandeis. But Harvard has not signed on to these.
I'm sure we're going to be hearing a lot more. Kirk Carapezza, thank you so much for being with us.
Crystal, thank you.